It has been, I think it's fair to say, a pretty bleak era as regards human rights for much of our species, of course, which is the human species. And, this is an age where we have seen courageous struggles, but at the same time, I think, pretty straightforward degeneration across multiple continents. We've seen, of course, the horrors being meted out to the Palestinian people. We've seen the invasion of Ukraine, but there's so many other examples of brutal and murderous oppression, the deprivation of people's basic rights. With that in mind, I'm really delighted to be joined by Ken Roth, who is the former and very long-standing executive director of Human Rights Watch. Of course, many of you will be very, very familiar with their work on a whole range of subjects. And he's also a visiting professor at Princeton. He's got a new book out, which is obviously absolutely crucial, called Righting Wrongs, which actually has a slightly more optimistic sort of angle than I suppose perhaps I laid out there. I want to start though. Great to see you, by the way. How are you? Nice to.
Thank you for having me on. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, I did start in a pretty bleak place. It does feel quite difficult not to feel bleak in the current moment. I mean, I think just an example with Palestine and what's going on in Gaza is I think it's the fact, I interviewed Raz Sigal, the Israeli-American associate professor of Holocaust and Genocide Studies, towards the beginning of this. And he said it's rare for intent to be so brazenly spoken. And I suppose the reason it has shocked and horrified so many people is it's with Western complicity, because people often go, well, what about X, Y, or Z? But we're talking about Western arms, Western complicity with a crime which is so brazenly confessed to and documented by not just its victims, but proudly by many of its perpetrators in the form of IDF soldiers posting them on TikTok. Which, I mean, you look at that and think that it looks like a very sharp decline. What do you think about that?
All right. Well, Owen, I mean, let me just begin. Let me take a step back for a moment before we get to Gaza, which is a very important thing to discuss. And, the main thing I want to accomplish with this book is to make clear that even in these abysmal situations like Gaza, there's always something to do. There's always an angle to put pressure on the perpetrator. And, Israel is no exception. Under the Biden administration, he was awful and that he just, as you noted, kept funding the Israeli military. But at least, he felt pressure to verbally push them to do the right thing, to stop starving Palestinian civilians, to stop bombing them. He suspended the 2,000-pound bombs that Israel was using to indiscriminately decimate entire neighborhoods, basically killing anybody within a 2-football field radius. So, we made some modest movement around the edge. There was some curtailment of the starvation strategy that ultimately Netanyahu was appropriately charged for by the International Criminal Court. But, today the real question is Biden's gone, Trump is here. What can you do? And if you push Trump to respect human rights, he says, what are those? So this is not a guy who's going to be a human rights defender in traditional terms. But I do think we can pressure Trump to do the right thing for the wrong reasons. And I outline, strategies like that in the book. But in this case, you always have to look at what does the despot, what does the autocrat want? What Trump wants is recognition for being this brilliant negotiator, the master deal maker. He wants a Nobel Peace Prize to, basically get the Saudis to normalize relations with Israel. So if we can make clear that that's not going to happen by expelling 2 million Palestinians from Gaza, a blatant war crime, a crime against humanity, but the only way to get progress is to, push Netanyahu to take concrete steps toward a Palestinian state, that's kind of our best step forward. And Trump has shown us that, he's willing to twist Netanyahu's arm. I mean, that's why we have the temporary ceasefire now. We've just got to get Trump, off this idea of embracing the Israeli far right, solving the Palestinian problem by getting rid of the Palestinians. We need to push him to start, taking a more constructive approach. And because Trump doesn't stand for anything other than himself, it's possible to move him. He's not committed to Israel necessarily. He's committed to himself, which for the time being, he thinks is advanced by embracing Netanyahu, but it doesn't have to always be that way.
Well, I mean, on that, maybe see what you think about this. I mean, you mentioned the Nobel Peace Prize, and it is widely reported that he does indeed covet the Nobel Peace
He
Prize.
says as much, the
No,
guy.
I know. But, and you say, well, he couldn't possibly end up getting the Nobel Peace Prize if he went ahead with the forcible, violent, in practice, removal of the Palestinian people in Gaza, which would be an inherently genocidal act, as many genocide scholars would point out. Henry Kissinger got the Nobel Peace Prize after he butchered much of Southeast Asia. He's one of the great American butchers of our time. Tom Lehrer, the American satirist, famously said he gave up on satire. So I don't know. I mean, going by the precedent of Henry Kissinger, he could still get the Nobel Peace Prize if he actually violently removed the people of Gaza.
Look, do I think he deserves the Nobel Peace Prize? Absolutely not. He would not get the Nobel Peace Prize for sure by committing a massive war crime against humanity.
Kissinger
that's not peace. That's just, an enormous atrocity. So, there's just no possibility there. The only way you get a peace prize is if you get peace. At least Kissinger signed the peace accord in Paris. For Trump to do that in a global sense, for the Middle East, really to have peace between the Israelis and the Palestinians, it's going to require a Palestinian state. And, to put this in context, Owen, there are a few options on the table. One, which is the Israeli government's preference, is the status quo, endless occupation. But as Human Rights Watch, all of our colleague organizations, the International Court of Justice have all found that's apartheid. That's not a sustainable solution. Another option, which would be fine with me, is to say, okay, the Israeli settlement project is so far advanced, a Palestinian state is impossible. We're going to recognize the one-state reality between the Mediterranean Sea and the Jordan River and give everybody there equal rights. But the Israeli government won't do that because, they would lose their Jewish majority. Now, the Israeli far right says, get rid of the Palestinians. That's what Trump has endorsed. That's not going to happen. All the Arab states unanimously have said, no way. And so the only option here, kind of the least bad option, is a two-state solution, a Palestinian state living side by side with an Israeli state. That's not where Trump is right now. But if Trump wants his Nobel Peace Prize, if he wants his peace plan, that's the only route to get it. And we need to kind of keep stressing that.
I mean, do you think, that's kind of flatter his ego, I guess. I mean, isn't the issue that just if we look at, because you said he's not committed to anything but himself. The people around him have said people who work for him say he's a fascist. Now, I don't think, if I'm honest, he's sat through and worked out the intricacies of fascist ideology, but he has the instincts, the impulses of fascism. I think that's what people are really getting at. He's impulsively and instinctively fascistic in a way that other US presidents, however reactionary awful they've been, haven't been in the same way at all. But he's surrounded by, the people he's surrounded by are ardent. Not just, we're talking about Israel and Palestine, but that's one example. They're ideologically committed. He would have to just abandon his entire faction because they're much more extreme than the first version.
It's true. The grown-ups in the room from the first version are no longer there. Trump has deliberately surrounded himself with weak, often incompetent people who are beholden to him, who are just yes men. They're sycophants and they're not going to say no. They realize saying no to Trump means you lose your job. And they've made their compact with the devil. So we can't really look to that entourage. But it also means that the entourage is not going to detain Trump if he changes his mind. And we've seen Trump already on the tariff issue, just go back and forth. The guy is not consistent. So, who would have thought that Trump would be more effective than Biden in pressing Netanyahu for a ceasefire? But he wanted, a ceasefire before he was inaugurated. And there's nobody to the right of Trump on the US political scene. So Netanyahu needs U.S. support. Trump says, agree to the ceasefire. Netanyahu does. So, we need that kind of dynamic. If Trump says, I want a Palestinian state, it would be in a 180-degree about face. But it is the kind of thing that nobody's going to stop him from. And we need to push him to do that.
In terms of, obviously, Israel and Palestine, in of itself, obviously, it matters, and the hideous war crimes and crimes against humanity being committed. But I think for many, there were lots of people around the world never took seriously Western claims to moral supremacy, not just because many of them were colonized in the most hideous way possible, enslaved, their resources stolen, subjected to famines, genocides, and all the rest. But, in the post after the struggles against colonialism, more recently the Iraq War and everything associated with it, the war crimes, which much of the world know better than people who live in the West, I would say. I mean, but what's happened here, I think it's just any claims to Western moral supremacy on the issue of human rights are buried in the rubble of Gaza. No one would ever, how could anyone ever take it seriously again? And what that means is the notion of human rights, there's no one even pretending to believe in human rights anymore. It's not even an ideological claim or pretense anymore.
Well, I mean, Owen, what you're describing is complete double standard, total hypocrisy. That's true, but it's not new. Just think back to the George W. Bush administration, where he was running around, torturing people in secret CIA detention centers, sending people off for, forever detention in Guantanamo. This was not the U.S. arming somebody else to do it. It was the U.S. doing it itself. So, and, obviously many European powers have got their colonial pasts. America's got all kinds of, awful foreign policy ventures. So, this is something we've dealt with for a long time. And one thing I try to stress in the book is that you need to look for coalitions to support human rights wherever you can. And, a few examples I give are situations where we were actually opposed by the United States, Russia, and China. So the three big powers were dead set against us, and we won anyway. So I, for example, describe the process where we secured a treaty to ban anti-personnel landmines, a treaty that has now, saved countless lives, countless people from being maimed. That was against the opposition of all those people. The same with the treaty banning cluster munitions, these indiscriminate weapons. And maybe most dramatically was the International Criminal Court, where, the U.S. wanted a court that would exempt Americans, so they would never be prosecuted for the kinds of foreign ventures that you described. And we said, no way, that's not justice. And the U.S. lost 120-7 in the 1998 Rome conference that founded the ICC. So, we know how to do this. And what it involves is, finding, in all those cases, about 60 small and medium-sized governments that had a more principled commitment to human rights and pushing it forward. And today, too, the world is a more multilateral place. I mean, who was it who brought the genocide case against Israel? Not the United States, no European power. It was South Africa. So I think we have to recognize that there are, for different reasons, governments around the world at different times that are willing to stand up for human rights. And the task of the human rights movement is to figure out, okay, which combination of governments can we draw on where the perpetrator will feel the heat? And there's always a way to do that. You just got to, figure it out and work out a strategy.
Do you worry, though, that what we're talking about here are kind of marginal or not marginal? I mean, these matter. I'm not saying these don't matter, these victories. But that in the overall, you get this kind of overall trend, the direction of travel, and you may win small victories or various victories which matter in their own right. But I mean, you mentioned, for example, Gaza and the £2,000 bond, and you're right, they got suspended under Joe Biden. I mean, Gaza has been wiped off the face of the earth. I mean, as when Donald Trump said a civilization has been wiped out in Gaza, which is what he was correct. I mean, he kept saying it. He said it's hell on earth. I mean, he's admitting to genocide there, because if a civilization's been wiped out, that's inherently genocidal by definition. But what I mean is, those £2,000 bombs got suspended, and yet 93% of homes in Gaza are severely damaged or destroyed. So you kind of look at it and think, well, okay, we've won that, but in the grand scheme of things, look what the net result still remains.
Yeah. Look, I mean, I don't pretend that we have, won a victory in Gaza. The Gaza has been decimated. The vast majority of the population is displaced. They have no home to return to. So I'm not claiming victory here. But in the book, what I try to stress is, first of all, the defense of human rights is an unending exercise. You need to always push, because governments love to violate human rights. It's a way to stay in power. It's a way to get rid of the opposition. It's a way to lawlessly accomplish things. And so, our task is to raise the cost of human rights violations, to change the cost-benefit analysis of repression. And, you win some, you lose some. But what I outline in the book is a bunch of cases with big adversaries where we won. I open up with the situation of Idlib in northwestern Syria, where the Syrians and Russians were deliberately bombing civilians, as in Gaza. They were deliberately attacking hospitals, schools, marketplaces, apartment buildings, while 3 million people were living there. And, Human Rights Watch documented this. We highlighted the chain of command of responsibility. But what ended up really mattering, we couldn't shame Assad, this guy who had already used chemical weapons against his people. We focused on Putin. And this was before his invasion of Ukraine. He still cared about his reputation, his relations with Europe. And so we enlisted the German, French, and Turkish governments. And Macron, Merkel, and Erdogan gradually twisted Putin's arm and got him to stop the bombing. And it took a long time to make this happen. We had to use the media to put pressure on these Western leaders too. But starting in March 2020, the bombing ended. It ended, completely for 3 years. It came back a little bit, but then, Idlib is where HTS, the rebel group, came from that just overthrew Assad. So basically, it ended permanently. And, now that doesn't justify Gaza. It's a totally different situation, but it shows that this kind of work can have dramatic effect in saving people from being slaughtered by bombs dropping from the sky. And, it's cases like that kept me going.
And it is, of course, it's very important. I mean, I say this obviously to tease about some of the arguments. I mean, because mentioning Russia, I wonder if this is something that's on my mind certainly a lot, in terms of how it complicates struggles such as the ones you're talking about. I've been to Belgrade, where I went there because lots of Russian exiles go to Belgrade, and spoken and interviewed them. Very courageous Russian exiles, obviously, who've left their lives, deeply traumatizing for them. It's just the process of what happened in Russia strikes me as something of a roadmap. Because what happened there is democracy, I mean, it was always very caveated there under Boris Yeltsin. There's a lot of continuity there. But nonetheless, it became a very worse than authoritarian regime by attrition. In the Duma today, the Russian parliament, there were 6 political parties. There are 20 registered political parties in Russia. They have elections. In Hungary, the regime of Orban will go, well, we have an independent press. Well, yeah, because a lot of business people who support Orban have bought up all the newspapers. The point I make is there's this new kind of way of you get rid of democracy by attrition behind the scenes. You don't sort of suddenly tanks on the streets, firing squads, everyone's in prison. But it's quite subtle, and it makes it much harder to organize in lots of ways because it's done in these very manipulative and Machiavellian ways, which make it harder to organize. Where the truth is done on its head, but they keep the presentation of being a democracy.
Yeah, well, I mean, Owen, you've clearly been reading from the Autocrat's Handbook, and what they say is you chip away at the checks and balances on your authority, you undermine the independent media, you undermine political parties, civil rights activists, whatever, and you have a sufficiently tilted playing field that you're pretty sure you're going to win. And that is the strategy of Viktor Orban in Hungary. That's the strategy of Erdogan in Turkey. But, that strategy is risky. And in fact, even Orban and Erdogan have been losing local elections, and they're now both at risk from a more organized opposition for the next national election. And the best indication of how dangerous that strategy is, I mean, look at somebody like Lukashenko in Belarus, who thought he had pursued that strategy. He lost the election, and then he had to cancel the election and pretend he won it. Putin doesn't dare try a managed election anymore. Why did he lock up Navalny and basically kill him in an Arctic prison? Because Navalny figured out how to gain that system back and to, even within a managed electoral process, to find ways to defeat the ruling party sufficiently to embarrass it. And so if you look at, what Ortega does in Nicaragua or what Museveni does in Uganda, these are no longer even managed elections. These are just electoral charades. And it reflects the fact, if you look around the world, people who live under autocracies don't want them. They want democracy. And we've seen these, huge mass protests in, a couple dozen countries around the world. And it's clear that, when you live under an autocracy, it's the last thing you want because the autocrat serves themselves, not the people. Sadly, it's in the established Western democracies that people who feel left behind are now somewhat more willing to hear the autocrat's appeal. But if you put yourself in the shoes of an autocrat and try to manage an election, it's a risky proposition, and most of them don't even try anymore.
But isn't that what's different now? Because whatever I think about the flaws of Western democracies as they exist, in terms of how wealthy elites have too much power and so on, and also attacks on civil liberties, which have gone on for a long time. Whatever I think about that, there remains a kind of flawed democracy. I would not bet everything I have on the US being a democracy in 10 years. And I wouldn't bet a lot of European countries. I don't know how things are going up in France, Germany for that matter, Italy. I mean, isn't that what's different? There's been a decline, a market decline, which includes in the West, which actually leaves democracy itself open to question.
Yeah. No, and I think you're accurately describing the Western established democracies. In other words, if you look at most of the global South, they make pretty clear in country after country that they want democracy, not autocracy. Ironically, it's in the West where they have democracy, where people feel, left behind. They feel that they're economically stagnating. They're facing growing inequality. They are not heard. They're not respected. They're not served by the government. And these are the people who are more willing to turn to a Trump or to an AFD in Germany or Marine Le Pen in France, reform, in the UK. Mm-hmm. And so, how do we counteract that? I think it's really in two ways. I mean, one is to press government, to press democracy to better serve everybody, not just the elites, not just the people who are benefiting from a global economy, but everyone, which they've not been good about doing. I think there's growing recognition of that now. But, the other thing we need to do is to counter the autocratic tendency to just pick some, disfavored minority, demonize them, and blame that person for every ill in society. And, the targets of those appeals are almost always immigrants. Often they're gays, but it's just picking somebody, appealing to the far right constituency and saying, it's all the migrants' fault. And we need to fight back against that by just showing that, in fact, the autocratic policy platform is empty. They don't have a plan to serve working people. They have a plan to serve themselves. And we need to, show the emptiness of their approach.
You've been obviously involved in so many of the struggles against heinous human rights abuses, whether that be, for example, in Rwanda, I know you were there just after the genocide, whether it be in Myanmar with the Rohingya Muslims. What are the, for you, kind of against all odds, in the circumstances like that, against all odds, reasons for hope that we can build on?
Well, I mean, in any of these situations, let's take Rwanda. So, Paul Kagame, the Rwandan leader, is a flawed leader from the start, because while he stopped the genocide, he also executed 30,000 people and has gotten away with that. Yeah. Since then, he's repeatedly invaded, what was then Zaire, now Democratic Republic of Congo. So, a decade ago, when he wanted Congo's minerals and sponsored this awful rebel group called the M23 that, runs around and kills and rapes civilians, Human Rights Watch, we had an office in Goma, the major city there, and we showed how the M23 was just a puppet of the Rwandan military. And Kagame said, no, you've got it wrong. So we put out another report, and Kagame lied again. And it took actually the third report for everybody to understand that Human Rights Watch was telling the truth, and Kagame was lying through his teeth. Now, at that stage, we were able to get the British Foreign Secretary, William Hague, and the U.S. Secretary of State, John Kerry, to call Kagame and say, you stop supporting the M23 or you lose your aid. And the M23 died within 3 days. It just disappeared. So that was super effective. Now, 8 years or so, the people of Eastern Congo lived without this predatory force. It's now back. And it's interesting to say, well, why is it back? And it's because Kagame has really worked to make himself indispensable. With the prior Tory government, he said, give me your asylum seekers. I'll do you a great favor. He's sending peacekeepers to Mozambique. He sponsors Arsenal. Why does it say visit Rwanda on Arsenal jerseys when Rwanda is, a brutal dictatorship where dissent leads to imprisonment or sometimes assassination? So he has learned how to game the system. These days, governments are condemning him. Britain has done a decent job of cutting off aid, but the U.S., others are continuing to provide aid. And it's going to take, a tougher response to this regime for it to stop in Eastern Congo. So, it highlights that the pressure can work, but it also has to be continuing pressure, because if you ease up, the dictators come back.
It's interesting you mentioned Rwanda, because I do think that it's very different situations if we look at Israel and Palestine, but there's a lack of understanding of the dynamics of genocide, I think, because it's not properly taught. But the people's reference point is generally the Holocaust, which is an outlier in lots of ways. It was an industrialized attempt to exterminate the entire Jewish people, and obviously slaughtered 6 million Jews, 2/3 of European population, in a very short period of time. In Rwanda, the so-called conflict began when the Rwandan Patriotic Front, as you mentioned, of Paul Kagame, invaded from Uganda and committed terrible atrocities. They obviously represent the Tutsi minority, and the Hutu the extremists of the Hutu majority said, "Look at the atrocities they're committed. They're going to commit genocide against us." And the genocide committed against the Tutsis in that 4 years running up, there were terrible atrocities which were committed actually against Hutus in that period, as well as obviously terrible pogroms against the Tutsis, which culminated in the genocide committed against Tutsis. But they justified it with the war crimes on the other side, didn't they? That the genocide of Rwanda was justified in those terms, which is they represent the Tutsi subpopulation represent an existential threat to us.
Well, I mean, Owen, you're making a few points here. Let me, if I could pick up on your view that our understanding of genocide was formed by the Holocaust, but also leads to too narrow an understanding. Because obviously, after a certain point, the Nazis wanted to kill every Jew they could get their hands on.
Exactly.
After a certain point, the Hutu extremists in Rwanda wanted to kill every Tutsi they could find. That's kind of classic genocide. But if you read the Genocide Convention, it says that it's genocide to kill a group in whole or in part. And let's take, the Rohingya, for example, in Myanmar. The Myanmar army killed about 30,000, so part of the Rohingya, in order to send 730,000 fleeing to Bangladesh. So that's still genocide. But they weren't killing everybody. They were killing just enough to accomplish their purpose. That was genocide as a means rather than an end. And I think that's actually the way to characterize Gaza, because Israel was not trying to kill 2 million Palestinians. They were trying to kill enough Palestinians so everybody would have to flee to Egypt, and they could depopulate Egypt and help solve their demographic issue. And so again, it's genocide as a means, not an end. Now, sadly, the World Court, the International Court of Justice, confuses these two. And they have said that if you're inferring genocidal intent from conduct, it has to be the only possible inference. And so what this means, if you think about it, is a defense to genocide is, no, we were just trying to commit this massive war crime of forced displacement, which is crazy. That can't be a defense. So I think the court is going to have to change its jurisprudence. But that's the odd position we're in right now. When in fact, there was a dual purpose. There was, genocide to, for the purpose of killing Palestinians. But the main purpose, I think, was killing enough to send everybody else fleeing.
I think it's a very, very important point. Just a couple of final points. One is actually something you alluded to, which is about the global South asserting itself. And of course, we saw that with South Africa, as you mentioned. Do you think that gives cause for hope? What's shifting now is certain countries in the global South are willing to assert themselves in a way they wouldn't maybe have done 10 or 15 years ago for various reasons.
Well, I think we have to recognize, and I get into this in my book quite a bit, that the defense of human rights is not just a Western matter. So, one example I give in the book is when Trump, in his first term, withdrew the United States from the UN Human Rights Council, which, nobody does. And so everybody said, oh, no, this big important government is not there to uphold human rights. The issue of Venezuela came on the agenda. And under Maduro, it's a super repressive regime. If Trump had led the effort, it would have been seen as an imperialist venture, not a principled effort, and it could have easily lost. But instead, a group of Latin American democracies plus Canada, under the label of the Lima Group, led the effort, won, because it was seen as a principled defense of democracy. And that shows the important role the global South can play. They played similar roles for, say, the International Criminal Court, where I think Africa was the continent that had the most members on the International Criminal Court. And African governments understood the importance of having this judicial deterrent to mass atrocities because they'd seen what happens when leaders get away with atrocities with impunity. So I do, the human rights are, globally sought. I've traveled the world. I've never met somebody who wants to be summarily executed, who wants to be tortured, wants to be deprived of healthcare or housing or education. So it is, in a sense, natural to find allies in the global South. You're not going to find them among autocratic leaders there, but you do find them among people. And when you have a democratically elected government, these governments are good candidates to be important defenders of human rights.
Finally, let's see if you can come up with a hopeful response to this. You're right. No one wants to be tortured. No one wants to be summarily executed, but they want other people to be tortured and executed in certain scenarios. That's the problem, where you get dehumanization. And what we've seen, particularly with the rise of the far right, is rampant dehumanization. And of course, that's what we see with the Palestinian people. They're being dehumanized to an extent where not just in Israel, but beyond, people just don't see Palestinians as human beings. That's the problem. No one would accept the level of horror being inflicted against the Palestinian people if they actually saw them as human beings. You just wouldn't do that. But I guess that's what I'm interested in, because, now with technology, we can see not just, in lots of different contexts, you can see these atrocities being committed. You might have thought that would actually help galvanize to stop them, but it hasn't actually happened. That hasn't worked. You can see now there's more information about atrocities being committed as they happen than in the history of our species. And yet it still feels as though the trajectory is in one direction, and that is the decline of human rights. So where do you think in the next few years, if I wasn't going to just sit in the rock in the fetal position dribbling, what is the hope given the context?
Yeah. Well, first, you're right, Owen, that the far greater availability of information today is an important part of the defense of human rights. So, I think back, to the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia, which murdered 2 million people, and nobody was quite sure what was going on. That couldn't happen today. Today, everybody has a smartphone. Everybody has access to social media. You can't hide these things. And disclosing is, step one in the process of putting pressure on governments. Now, you're right to note that while people want human rights for themselves, they don't necessarily want human rights for others. And, excuse me, the challenge for the human rights community is really to build a stronger sense of national community in each of our countries, so people cannot be excluded from them. And, here this is an ironic effect, I think, of the progressive focus on, identity politics, because if we're just a collection of individual interests, it's easy for the far right to say, well, we're just going to carve out the immigrants or carve out the gays. But if we stress that, we're actually a national community where everybody has rights, it's harder to do that. And so I think progressives, while continuing to defend people who are left behind, who are persecuted, we also have to become more comfortable speaking about a national community where we all have basic rights. And, it had been the right that spoke in those terms. They've given that up. They now are siding with the autocrats.
Yeah.
It's important for the progressives to pick up this rhetoric.
Ken, it's been such an honor. Righting Wrongs, 3 decades on the front lines battling abusive governments is now out. Make sure you get yourselves a copy. I should say I probably retweet Ken about once a week at least, because he's always incisive and a really great resource when it comes to looking at the atrocities which are being committed, which governments, Western governments, are complicit in facilitating, or which are just ignored, aren't given the attention that they deserve. And obviously, for those of us who do believe in a world free of injustice and horror, knowing what those horrors actually are, what we can actually do about them is absolutely crucial. And knowing that these are not inevitable, despite the trajectory we're currently on, that things can and will change. So please like and subscribe, leave your comments. Good for the algorithm, which is great, because then more people will listen, which is the point. And Ken, great to speak to you. Thanks so much.
Thanks for having me, Owen. I enjoyed it a lot.